Greetings, everyone. Sorry for the late start. We obviously jumped off another stream with two fellow or regulars on the show in the past couple of years, James Kalinzi and Michael Rossi. We were talking about Hungary and the election and the implications for Europe, Ukraine, the United States, NATO, etc. But obviously, we also have just a naval blockade being imposed, or as Michael joked at the end of the stream, a blockade on a blockade, a toll on a toll. There's so much happening right now. The UK has also said that it wants to rejoin the European single market, or looking at that. Trump made himself look like a pope on Twitter yesterday. The point I'm making is that there is so many geopolitical or important international issues to cover that it is a genuine struggle to know where to put your focus. It's almost an Achilles heel for me, because I called my show, or the podcast when I originally started it as an audio podcast, The Global Gambit, thinking that it would somehow be a good idea to focus on everything globally. But when everything's kicking off globally, you never know where to put your focus. However, our intention this time is to look at the Strait of Hormuz, look at the naval blockade, understand the escalation ladder. We've had some great discussions with some other academics, but I am delighted to be rejoined by Amir Handjani, who is a non-resident fellow at the Quincy Institute, and who we've had on. I think this is your third appearance now, Amir, isn't it?
I think so.
I was just explaining to some viewers, I just left a stream with a couple of colleagues about Hungary. And now we're here in Iran and the Middle East, because there's so many geopolitical flashpoints, hotspots, that, you know, someone calling their show The Global Gambit is sort of a bit of an exercise in masochism or something, masochism or whatever. But my point, jokes aside, is
better than anybody else.
Exactly. But my point being is simply, here we are. The blockade has been now imposed for the best part of 6 hours, I think. But there've been clarifications by CENTCOM and a couple of other, players, that it only applies to Iranian ports and vessels that are associated with Iranian trade or whatever activity, commerce. So
I don't know what that means, though.
That was my first question. Right. How do you verify that? But two, if you're not a naval admiral expert, but how does this work? What do you think Trump's strategy and rationale is for this? Or is he just he's trying to force the IRGC's hand?
I first of all,
also, cheers. I'm not cheersing the blockade. I'm just having some Prosecco for Hungary.
Well, I'm just having sparkling water. So I don't know if you're supposed to cheers with sparkling water, but it's very ambiguous, because yes, this only applies. So let's look at the Persian Gulf and the Straits of Hormuz and sort of where we are. Iran is effectively operating a toll booth, right? Mm-hmm. They're saying that there are certain ships of countries and destination vessels that either are friendly to Iran or pay the toll, get to go through. Now, the U.S. has said, we're going to blockade all Iranian ports, essentially gunboat diplomacy, right? And we know a blockade is an act of war. Mm. The U.S. is not in the Persian Gulf right now. They're outside in the Gulf of Oman and the Indian Ocean. So are they blockading Iranian boats that are coming in and out of the Strait of Hormuz, going to dock on Iranian shores? Or are they blockading ships belonging to China, India, and other Asian countries that call on Iranian ports to get oil, petrochemicals, and other natural resources? That hasn't really been specified. And I think that ambiguity serves the US. However, we had just in the last few hours or earlier today that head of the Chinese military, a very senior general, saying, we're not going to tolerate any interruption with our commercial ties with Iran. So you could possibly have a situation whereby the US Navy is turning away Chinese merchant vessels, and that could ring us up the ladder of escalation between the United States and China. I don't think that's going to happen. Because I think it's not Taco Tuesday yet, but I think like the tariffs and like everything else Trump does, there's an element of crony capitalism. There's an element of, I want someone to pick up the phone and call me and, have a conversation with me and stroke my ego. I think he's going to Swiss cheese this thing. And they're going to let some boats through and some boats not. And it's not going to be too effective. And one of the reasons I say that is that's been Trump's history in his second term. Wasn't the way he was in the first term, but second term it's certainly been that way. And also look at the markets today. The markets are seeing past this now. And I think the reason why they're seeing past this is because they foresee some sort of resolution that's non-kinetic between Iran and the United States.
Well, certainly, maybe it's because I'm in social media, or I have to get likes and clicks and engagement, and don't forget to like and subscribe, everybody watching. But jokes aside, is that this doesn't seem to have the same level of urgency or risk factor. Correct me if I'm wrong. Maybe the markets are not the metric by which we should be judging it, but there seems to be an interpretation that this is, and I'll frame it to you as a question because it's something I put to a couple of military figures we've had in the past, 24 hours, 36 hours since this became the apparent direction we're going, which is simply, if you look at game theory and how it applies to escalation or strategic decision making, people think of prisoner's dilemma. I guess you could argue that applies here, but the one that more applies here, I think, is brinksmanship. It applies the idea of game of chicken. Who's going to back out first? Is that what Trump's attempting to do here?
I think so, and I think, but in that game, I think Trump loses and the U.S. loses. It's not because the U.S. is the more dominant power. Of course, it's the more dominant economic and military power. But in this instance, in the contours of which Trump has defined success, for Iran, this is existential. They can take the pain, and they have the endurance. The global economy cannot take the pain. And Trump and the United States do not have endurance. To effectively have a blockade of Iran for, more than a couple of weeks is going to require immense resources. Immense amount of boats that need to be resupplied, need to come into dock, that need to be then traded in with other boats that go out to port. So this is not easy to do. That's why blockades, throughout history, they're in our recent history, we don't have too many examples of it, because they're highly costly, and they're better ways to get to your outcome than having a blockade, which is an act of war. And I don't think this is going to be that kind of blockade. I think he's going to Swiss cheese it, because I don't.
Well, can you explain what that means? Like, what do you mean by Swiss cheese? Maybe I'm being.
Well, China imports 6 to 8 million barrels of oil a day. 90% of Iran's oil comes from 90% of Iran's oil goes to China. They need that oil. Okay, their economy will be in crisis and free fall if they don't get that oil, and they're not going to tolerate the United States turning away their merchant ships to get that oil.
Okay, that's fair enough. So in this regard, then, what I've seen is that the Iranians and the Americans have continued discussions.
Yes,
backdoor diplomacy is
for
happening.
sure.
I mean,
And I'm sure they're going to meet again in Islamabad.
Well, no, it's already been established. Well, from my understanding, I saw an update on X earlier saying that they're going to meet on Thursday, which I mean was kind of inevitable. Is this just like some last hurrah from Trump to try and come across like the you know, the one who's directing things?
I think so. Well, it's not clear. It's not clear who's steering the ship, what the objective is. What is Trump's objective? Is his objective to have regime change in Iran? That didn't work. Is his objective to have a deal? What we know the contours of the deal. The contours of the deal have been there for a long time. The new element in this is the Straits of Hormuz. And that's because of the war that was launched on Iran and the damage done to Iranian infrastructure. And what the Iranians are saying is, we need compensation for that damage. And we need to make sure that that doesn't happen again. That's why the Straits of Hormuz is such a flashpoint. Now, Trump could come up with a formula with the Iranians on the Straits of Hormuz, whereby Iran gets compensated. Also, the Arab countries in the Persian Gulf who've suffered damage from Iran should get compensated as well. And I'm sure he wants a cut too for the United States. I'm sure that can be worked out. But there's no rationale for Iran to let go of that leverage, because if all Trump can threaten is another war, but I'm not even sure another war if we don't come back to where we are today with Iran's leverage even strengthened, because what they're going to do after that war is, or during that war, is launch massive attacks on the Arab states of the Persian Gulf, doing much more damage to their infrastructure. So it's the enriched uranium, getting it out, whether it's blended in the country or sent out, having some low level of domestic enrichment in Iran that's no sunset clauses, that's monitored for a long time, maybe forever, and some formula for the Straits of Hormuz that gets Iran compensated for the damage that's been caused.
Yeah, no, I mean,
that's where this ends. How we get there, I think, is a lot of theatrics and brinksmanship, gunboat diplomacy, game theory, but that's how it ends.
Yeah, I mean, you know, even as we talk about it now, there's sort of the reasoning behind it, and I know people in the comments are quickly being like, stop trying to apply game theory or reasonable thinking to Donald Trump and human emotion, it doesn't work, which I get the limitations of it, you know, Nash Equilibrium and the whole the great film, what's the film called with Russell Crowe, you know,
A Beautiful Mind.
Yeah, I get it, I do get it, but equally we have to consider the chess pieces, because Trump's not playing 3D chess, he's not playing 4D chess. That's so 2025. He's playing 5D chess everywhere.
I think he's playing checkers, actually.
No, I'm taking the piss, but it's sort of this attempt by I try to be objective on this channel. Of course, I will try to be objective. I will acknowledge the different perspectives, but do I have my biases? Yes, I'm pretty anti-Trump, and I think he's a bloody idiot, to put it mildly. But like, I just don't see the fervor around this, right? I don't see this lasting more than a week or a couple of weeks. I don't think that there's enough energy around it to really sustain the sort of intensity that America's going to close the whole of the Strait of Hormuz and create Armageddon, economic Armageddon. I just don't see that. It doesn't have the same fervor the initial, you know, week of the actual operations. Israel's now pre-focused on Lebanon, and even that, it seems to be in a phase of more talks than military operation. You know, they're talking to Lebanon. I don't know. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, Amir, but you know, is this just going to be sort of by the end of this week, we hopefully do actually have a genuine ceasefire that holds? And if not, and even if we do, what comes after that? Is it just an unresolved conflict?
I don't think you have an unresolved conflict. I think, you know, Iran and the U.S. negotiated the JCPOA over 2.5 years. That was 12 years ago or 11 years ago. A lot's happened in the interim. Iran and the US have 47 years of grievances with each other. They're not going to resolve those in 21 hours in Islamabad. I'm not sure they're going to resolve those in 2 weeks.
So what's the point?
I think what's going to happen is you're going to have more talks. You need to have expert level talks on a technical level. It's not Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff. You know, I mean, in the JCPOA, the U.S. had nuclear scientists, nuclear physicists at the talks. They had diplomats with 30, 40 years of experience, a team of them engaged in talks with Iran over a period of years to get there. So I think what you'll see happen, well, there are three possibilities. You could have the talks not work because Iran's not going to fold, and we go back to kinetic action and war. It's one possibility. I think more likely you're going to have a possibility of, the talks are working and we're going to have ongoing talks and this ceasefire gets stretched out for a period of time.
Right.
Or you could have some ambiguous, cryptic document after the talks this week saying, we have sort of a framework of resolving issues and, it's all over now and we'll deal with the framework. Iran's letting these ships through and we've ended our blockade and, we're making progress. My bet is on the last one. And if not the last one, the second one. I don't see a return to kinetic action, to war, because in a war, the U.S. hand is further weakened at the table, because then Iran's going to ask for more.
Interesting. I mean, a couple of things to that then. On your point about the kinds of people that were being part of the negotiations, we've had some great speakers on the show before, and one of them was part of the JCPOA negotiations or was sort of shadowing it in the past. And even this time, they pointed out in a previous conversation we had that the Iranians came to this set of talks much more kitted out, like with actual negotiators or diplomats, professionals. And I'm not saying that diplomats know everything or that I'm supporting the IGC or Islamic Republic suddenly, but the point is Witkoff is a property magnate, mogul, whatever. Jared Kushner, I mean, okay, they've achieved sort of things occasionally, but it's usually because they're a bridge between two other parties. They're the third party negotiate, not actually the negotiating side against their opposing force, let alone the fact that they don't have any encompassing professionals with an understanding of Iran, nuclear elements, none of that. So it seems to me like the Iranians do want to genuinely find a drawdown versus the Americans, which are just sort of pissing about or pissing into the wind, as someone else said to me. I don't know if you'd agree with that framing.
I would, because I saw the lineup over the weekend of who was at the talks on the Iranian side. And I've never seen a lineup like that. They had the central bank, obviously the foreign minister, the Speaker of Parliament. They had
the Speaker of Parliament,
yeah. They had the head of the Parliament Committee of Foreign Affairs. They had a number of senior IRGC generals there. It was a heavy duty delegation, and that's a delegation that can kind of deal, right? Because they want to kind of deal. And, whatever one thinks of the Supreme Leader, the deceased Supreme Leader, I think a very fair criticism of him, and one that I made over the years, is he was unable to make decisions on big issues.
Really?
Yes. I mean, he was not, he would try and split the baby, if you will. And because I think he was much more risk averse than the cadre you have now. I think actually what Israel and the US did when they wiped out those generals and the leadership that was running Iran in the upper echelons of the IRGC, they were much more cautious and they were older and wiser, let's say. This group they have now are like the young Turks. They're hungry and they're you know, they have endurance, that they want to fight, they want to prove themselves, but they also can make decisions. And I think that's what I'm not seeing on the American side. It's unclear if J.D. Vance and Kushner and Witkoff can make decisions. It is very clear to me that Kushner and Witkoff are out of their depth negotiating. I mean, what have they negotiated? There's been no peace in Ukraine and Russia. You know that better than anybody. The Gaza thing seems like a disaster, the Board of Peace. And with Iran, you know, we've had 2 wars in 9 months. So I don't know why people have faith in Kushner or Witkoff. Most Americans don't. It seems that Trump does.
Yeah, look, I mean, you know, what I find interesting about these sorts of things is that what Trump is single-handedly, and by extension his inner circle of the administration, they are bringing together woke liberals or woke leftists, neoliberals, populist rights. I don't like using labels too much, but my point is that they're bringing everybody together about this. And seemingly people don't like the IRGC or anyone of a reasonable mind, unless they are just contrarian or, you know, has some ulterior motive. No one really likes the IRGC and the Islamic Republic and its treatment of the Iranian people. We prefer a more constructive government, or not so much. I'm not supporting Western interventionism to remove and reinstate the Shah or something. We're talking about that the Iranian people have more self-determination. That's the point. But Trump is such a cockwomble. Excuse me for using that phrase, but it's just came into my head. It's one of my favorite British things. But he's such a numbnut. He's such an idiot. He's making this like he's even worse than the IRGC because
he's making the IRGC look like the grown-ups in the room.
Reasonable decision makers. Yeah.
And everything Iran has done from how it operated during the war to how it's operating during the ceasefire seems reasonable and professional. We may not like them. We have strong disagreements with the IRGC and how they run the country, and human rights abuses and all those things that are well documented. But, you know, they are competent insofar as managing Iran's negotiating position against a superpower. That's not easy to do.
No, it's not. I mean, no, but if I can just, from a personal anecdote, Amir, like, you know, running this channel, for just example, running this outlet medium is fascinating because I try to bring diversified opinions. You come at it from a more restrained, well, correct me if I'm wrong, but Queen's Institute, and I'm not saying you're directly affiliated, but that organization, for example, we've had Trita Parsi on the program, and, you know, that's more of an emphasis of exercising restraint in foreign policy. What I've also had people on from the Foundation of the Defense of Democracies, which is obviously a lot more hawkish. And what I find fascinating is that even someone who is more, I don't know, orientated towards traditional republicanism is like, what America's doing is making Israel in a bad position vis-a-vis Lebanon, and you know, we don't support Israel's foreign policy in that regard. And it's like, right, so how abysmal is this decision to go to war? How much have we completely thrown up in an air?
Oh, I think, well, I'll give you 3 anecdotes to that question. For the war, Iran's oil was sanctioned for the last 35 years. It's not sanctioned today. Before the war, Iran didn't control the Straits of Hormuz. They do today. Before the war, the Gulf energy infrastructure was not damaged, and the Gulf was viewed as an oasis for peace, stability, and capital investment. Question mark if that's going to be the case moving forward now. Before the war, you know, Qatar's LNG trains were working wonderfully. Now they've suffered $26 billion worth of damage, and 20% of Qatar's LNG is going to be offline for 3 to 5 years. You know, untold billions of dollars of damage to energy infrastructure in the region. Untold billions of dollars damage to U.S. investment in the region by U.S. companies. You know, Amazon data centers. So this is, and I'm not sure we've accomplished, and I say we as the United States, what have we really accomplished? Iran can still, if Iran couldn't fire missiles that could reach Israel in the Gulf, Donald Trump wouldn't have pushed the Prime Minister of Pakistan to push the Iranians for a ceasefire. Because when you're winning, you don't ask for a ceasefire. You keep going.
Yeah.
So it's huge. It's huge. It's a huge issue of credibility that's been lost, and it's also what did we achieve? Have you ever seen the movie Happy Gilmore? Adam Sandler. I just
watched Happy Gilmore 2 a few weeks ago, being like, why did it take them 25 years to make a sequel?
Do you remember when the guy said, you know, we're just all dumber for this? That scene where he said, you know, what you just said, we're just all dumber we've all just been dumber for the last 6 weeks going through this.
No, I mean, look, I as I say, running this program, it's interesting. We've got just looking through the comments on this stream. We've got such a diversity of opinions.
I can't see it. I wish I could see it. Who's the comments?
I would put it on screen, but I feel like it might be it might dominate the screen.
I see it now. Okay, I'm looking at it.
Oh, you can see it. Oh, great. Okay, great. No, but you can see there's a great diversity of opinions here. We've got people who are pro-Trump, but sort of not necessarily agreeing with this action. We've got people who are complete, well, not complete, but supporters or sympathetic to Iran. It's quite a mesh of opinions. And the reason I'm emphasizing this is, again, Trump seemingly single-handedly, sort of like Hungary. I'm just going to use that as another reference point because we had a talk about that. Trump is pushing traditional populists or other populists like Farage, Le Pen, Meloni to be like, we need to consider our European future because he's threatening Europe so much. He's forcing other populists to consider the European Union in a way that they never were because they were Eurosceptic. In the same way that he's pushing more people to be like, wow, US foreign policy really is problematic in the Middle East right now. And Iran, not again that we support the IRGC, but yeah, they seem more reasonable right now.
Because I think no one wants the global post-COVID, the global economy has been in a very tumultuous state. We've had a lot of shocks, and I think populism has been on the rise. But populism has been on the rise for a rationale. And one of the rationales of populism has been, we're not going to go fight wars in other countries and waste our resources and manpower. We're going to focus on our population, our economy, and our borders. Donald Trump came into office this time and was in office last time, actually, very much focused on those things. And, you know, there was an argument he made, if it wasn't for COVID, he would have probably won the last election in a landslide. I think that's probably true because the economy was doing well and he was sort of delivered on a lot of what he campaigned on, which is I'm going to focus on the borders. I'm going to focus on reindustrializing America. I'm going to focus on the U.S. economy. We're not going to go do stupid wars. Since he's been in office now for the last 14, 15 months, he's reversed himself. We've engaged in gunboat diplomacy in Venezuela, regime change in Venezuela, 2 wars with Iran, the Liberation Day tariffs, which were a disaster. We haven't reindustrialized America. The U.S. economy was doing well before he came into office, is now backsliding a bit. There has not been meaningful job growth. So even though he campaigned as a populist to do no more foreign wars and focus on our border, what he's actually done is become a neocon. He's fulfilled the neocon agenda, which is, you know, we've had regime change in Syria, we had regime change in Libya, we had regime change in Iraq. Iran, we really want regime change in Iran. Let's try that now. Well, that didn't work. let's try something else. And I think populists around the globe look at that, people like Farage and Le Pen, and say, that's not what we're about. That's not what we're selling to our people. We're not selling foreign wars to our people, because foreign wars mean more refugees, more destabilization, more trouble within our borders. So, and Orban lost this weekend, not by someone who's so much different than Orban, but someone who sort of saw the tea leaves and saw it campaigning, against Orban. So, I think Trump's been a disaster for the United States.
So, no, but just if I can just jump in on one. So, I want to get your take on sort of three different perspectives here, just to sort of different people have different, obviously, interpretations of how things could go. Trita has said to the BBC earlier, just reading it now, most likely scenario could be that the two countries don't ever reach an agreement, which I think is quite plausible, given what we touched upon in terms of the negotiating inequality. But a new status quo is created, with the US simply ditching talks and Iran charging for the passage of the Hormuz. Both sides would therefore claim the victory, which is the critical point to me. As we've seen time and again between these two players, they always like to try and claim a win. When Iran struck Qatar, or the American bases in Qatar, the Americans didn't respond, but that was because Iran literally told them, we're going to strike you at this time in this way and get your people out. So the Iranians didn't have to, the Americans didn't have to respond or escalate, but the Iranians could say that they, fought back against the American war machine, sort of thing. So they both can claim a win. Conversely, Robert Malley, who is the special envoy for Iran, says it's going to be difficult for the Iranian decision makers, regardless of what happens, because in their mind, and this is something that I kind of wanted to take the talk down, was about the nuclear element. The Iranians don't want to obviously give up their enriched uranium, because that makes it possible that Trump reneges and just reimposes sanctions anyway. So,
Well, I think there has to be some sort of deal. So I'm going to disagree slightly with Trita on this. I think there has to be some sort of deal, because what's ultimate failure for Trump and for the Iranians, what's ultimate failure for Trump is if he's got this enriched uranium inside Iran with no deal, right? With a very hawkish IRGC leadership now there, who would have every reason to go nuclear. They may be doing that now. I mean, I don't know. For the last 6 weeks, we were told 95% of Iran's missile launchers and 80% of their drones have been knocked out. Yet, the last 10 days of the war, their drones and missile launchers usage were going up. And now we find out that they still have thousands and thousands of missile launchers and drones, and they could prosecute this war for months. So I think from the U.S. perspective, dealing with that enriched uranium, you can't deal with that without a deal. From Iran's perspective, you can't deal with the economic fallout from this war without a deal, without some sanctions relief, and without having the issue of the Hormuz resolved. And I would add, making sure this war doesn't happen again. And that's why I think Hormuz becomes very critical for Iran, because with their hands on the valve in Hormuz, it would most likely mean it wouldn't happen again, because the world wouldn't be able to tolerate this again. That's why Trump wanted the ceasefire.
Well, but that's a good point, and it makes me think of something else that I was thinking about, which is, in this regard, Iran now sees the Hormuz Strait as its biggest leverage point, more than the nuclear element over the past few weeks, right?
Correct. I totally agree with you. The nuclear element, they were always ready to give up for some low level of domestic enrichment. We're only in this mess of high level enrichment because Trump pulled out of the JCPOA. If Trump stayed in the JCPOA, Iran would never be enriching at these levels. They're enriching at these levels because the U.S. pulled out. They wanted leverage in talks with the U.S.
I had a phase of pivoting to being critical of the JCPOA. I mean, it is a flawed deal, but it's still a deal that was established. No deal is going to be perfect, and
all deals are flawed.
Yeah,
no deal gets you everything you want. If a deal gets you everything you want, that's one-sided. It's not a good deal.
Well, no, I made this point to Ali Versif Crisis Group, International Crisis Group, a couple of weeks ago, right? And the point is that the Iranians were operating in a certain way. Can we argue that they were maybe lying or manipulating? Possibly, but you still had a framework and a basis by which to work with, which Trump completely blew up, metaphorically, by leaving. And ever since really 2017, 18, when he did that, we've been in a downward trajectory with this. I mean, when the Iranians seized the tankers in 2018, 2019, right, in June, I can't remember exactly when, that was the first indication that they were going to start leveraging this point.
Yeah, no, I mean, look, the JCPOA was an imperfect deal. All deals are imperfect. You find me a perfect deal where both sides feel that they got everything they wanted. It doesn't exist. And if one side feels they got everything they wanted and the other side feels screwed, then they have every reason to not to do their end of the bargain of the deal. So the JCPOA did enough that it put the Iran nuclear issue in a box and actually gave Iran some sanctions relief. But I think what's gone on now, Iran at the end of this will get much bigger sanctions relief than it would have had in the JCPOA days, because it has more leverage now than it had. It didn't control the Hormuz during the JCPOA. It does now.
So what? I think we've touched upon it already, but let's touch upon it again. Is Trump literally just going to come out with a refurbished, rebranded name of the same bloody deal then?
I mean, I think you should. I always say they should have just X'd out JCPOA and just called it the Trump deal. He would have been.
Whatever, that's what he wants to do. He just wants to rename it with Trump in it.
Yeah, I mean, in the last 10 years, it's just been theater, right? It's just
that's what he did with NAFTA. He just called it USCMA.
USMCA. Yeah, I think we're going to get to some level.
You think it's that? You literally think it's going to be that?
I don't think it'll be exactly the same. I think the U.S. will ask for more. Maybe there'll be no sunset clauses. I think there'll be more intrusive inspections.
Would the Iranians agree to that?
I think they would if the sanctions relief, they get out of the penalty box, if you will. I don't think you're going to get any deal on missiles, because why would Iran show that the missiles are their deterrent? Without their missiles, they have no defense. So they're not going to get any. I don't know that's going to be on the table. I think they'll limit it to what it is now, which is 2,000 kilometers, which gets them to Israel. That's all they really care about, right? They don't want missiles to hit London and Paris and Rome. That's insane. And so I think, I think you're going to have some sort of JCPOA 2.0, maybe more stringent on inspection, more stringent on Iranian demands, on American demands on domestic enrichment. But on the other end, Iran's going to get much more in terms of sanctions relief and economic relief.
So let's leave that there for now then. The other angle of this is, of course, that it's all part of the Trump plan. I'm not going to dig that again or whatever, but more sort of, the Gulf states have created enough contingency plans. There's enough energy now leaving their infrastructure, which isn't being bombed, over Saudi Arabia proper, or there are other pipelines that can be leveraged.
I don't think that's true. There's not enough energy leaving. The pipelines at full capacity get you about 25 to 30%, but that's at full capacity, and that doesn't even deal with LNG, and that there are no pipelines for. You need to put it on tankers. They can build that pipeline infrastructure, but that takes years. And there are all sorts of issues between the UAE, Saudi Arabia. You're going to have to get those pipelines across Saudi Arabia, right? Or Oman. And last I checked, the Omanis and the Iranians were working together on a transit authority.
Yeah, I mean, there's this element about Iran and Oman sharing the toll. Um, I don't know if Iran comes out of this charging something. I mean, is that the worst thing? I'm not saying I support it, but given that we're in this situation, we have to sort of work with what the reality is now. Is that the worst situation going forward? I mean, you're welcome to jump in on that point, but the other thing,
Well, I don't support it. I mean, it's not a question of whether I support it or we support or we're against it. I would prefer a world whereby it was pre this war, where the Straits of Hormuz were completely open. But that world doesn't exist anymore. We've had this war, and wars have consequences. And I think that unless Iran's going to say you've launched 2 wars on me in the middle of negotiations, unprovoked, and you've done, huge damage to my domestic national infrastructure and energy infrastructure, and I have to be compensated for that. How are you going to compensate me for that? Same time, the Arabs, I'm sure, will also say, Iran has to compensate us, for the damage it's done, and they'd be right to say so. So there has to be some sort of mechanism there at work, and that's what I outlined in my piece of foreign policy. I outlined how that would, how I think that could work.
Oh, you have a piece? Well, then I'll be sure to link it in the description for people to go and read. But
I said the war ends with the Hormuz toll booth.
Okay, well, there you go, guys. Like, be sure to check out that piece. We'll definitely, yeah, as I say, we'll definitely link that. But this is where I don't know. There's so many pieces moving, Amir. Maybe I'm just tired. I don't know, but I'm just so difficult to keep track of it all. What does this do for the Gulf states' sentiment towards the United States? What about Iran? Iran has struck the Gulf states, and so people who are pro-Trump are claiming that they're going to get involved in the war. They never did, and still haven't. Probably won't. But on the other hand, Trump's actions has pissed off MBS and the Gulf states towards America. So which is it? They're pissed off to the Iranians, or they're pissed off to the Americans, or both, or
if I'm in the Gulf states, I'm rightly extremely pissed off at the Americans because they invested in Trump, invested in the United States. They did so much for the Trump administration and giving him international legitimacy. Playing and in U.S. investment, in AI, data centers, and what did they get for it? All it took was Bibi Netanyahu telling Trump, let's do this. He listened to Bibi and not the Gulf. And where did the blowback happen? It happened in the Gulf. It happened to them. So and then I'd also be pissed off at the Iranians because, hell, you're our neighbors. Why are you doing this to us? We didn't launch the war against you. So I think that they were caught in between, and there was not proper planning by Israel and the United States to bring in the Gulf and prepare them for this. Probably because they would have said, no, we don't want to do this. This is wrong. I think there are probably elements in the Gulf that thought, well, maybe if this happened, it's not a good thing, but it'll knock out the Iranian regime and we'll have new leadership there. But I think that was wishful thinking.
So I'm going to humor it briefly because there's a lot of comments about it, but I've even seen it in the BBC, and obviously it's an underlying element to all of this, which is, I'll frame it with this emphasis, which is this war was all about weakening China. That was the 5D chess by the Americans to remove Venezuela and then Iran from the global chessboard as America prepares for its ultimate battle with China. I think that's complete nonsense. But China is obviously relevant here because Iran does listen to China. China is, and you mentioned it earlier on about the general and his comments. So, what do you think the calculus there is? Is how relevant is China in all of this?
I mean, China is a comprehensive challenge for the United States. It's the pacing challenge, right? I mean, it's since the days of the Soviet Union, we never had a pure competitor like China, and I would say that China either has eclipsed or will eclipse the Soviet Union in terms of being the only real way it's not is in nuclear weapons inventory. They have a few hundred, and the U.S. has thousands of nuclear warheads. But in every other way, it's a peer competitor. At the same time, I'm not sure any of Trump's policies this time around. Last time around, I think, he rightly diagnosed some issues with China and addressed them, and Biden picked up on them. This time around, I think he's been a total disaster on China. He's actually made China look like the grown-ups in the room. I think it's his behavior toward NATO, toward Greenland, Denmark, what he did in Venezuela. I think it made the world look around. Even those who didn't like the Maduro regime said, we need to hedge ourselves a bit. Europe, Spain today, the prime minister was in China. I think he's hedging. I think the chaos around Donald Trump and his decision making is actually helping China and hurting the United States. I don't think in any way this hurts China, other than temporarily with the price of oil and it not being able to get as many barrels from the Persian Gulf. That being said, that's going to be resolved. China is the largest trading partner of all the Persian Gulf states, including Iran. So that oil can't come to the United. We have oil here. We don't need it. So we're not going to deny that those countries send their oil to China.
No, I mean, absolutely. The Chinese were instrumental in establishing the rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia a couple of years ago. They've tried to exercise their interest in the Middle East, albeit I think in, inconsistent ways. I don't get too drawn into either one side. China's taking over the world or China's imminent collapse. I think it's nonsense. I made a video about a month ago talking about, the real reason China isn't panicking about this war. For other reasons being that they have about a year's worth or 6 months, I think, supply of reserves of oil and stuff. So it's never really about that. But I do think that they were worried about is the precedent it sets. If there can be regime change in Iran, then what can happen with the CCP in China and the sort of the galvanization it means for people to want to see diversification in leadership. But even that, the export of that from Iran to China is a completely different region, completely different culture, completely different factors. So I think China is a little bit overplayed in all of this. People like to reference it because it's the grand strategic rivalry between those two countries. America's going after, therefore China's involved, and it's all part of this grand strategy. It's all part of the world order shifting. But I just think this was Trump's reactionary idiocy over Iran and the lack of peace talks that were going anywhere back in February. I don't know if you would agree with that, but I guess one of my last questions is simply, where do you see this going? Is this week going to be hectic or not as much as we think?
I think I see it. I think there's going to be a resolution. Whether that resolution comes at the end of the 9 days that are left, I'm not sure, but I think it's going to be a process. And at the end of the process, there'll be some resolution of this issue, on the issue of the enriched uranium, as well as the issue of the Hormuz. Now, will that be a grand bargain with the U.S. and Iran? I'm writing a piece on that right now, actually. I think it lends itself to that, because if Iran's going to give up that enriched uranium and the Hormuz issue is going to be resolved, then you're talking a very big deal, right? That's not a small deal. That's a big deal. Iran's going to want big things from that, and so is the U.S. So I actually think it gets resolved. Because the alternative of it not being resolved is much worse for all the parties involved, for Israel, the U.S., and Iran.
All right. Well, that's quite a hopeful point to end on, Amir. I wouldn't mind a bit more of a normal lifestyle again. As much as I love talking to you on a semi-weekly basis, I want a slightly more. I don't know. I want to be able to focus on one issue at a time instead of like, oh God, Hungary, NATO, and Trump, Iran, China's going to be attacking Taiwan at some point. It's all crazy. People are going off in the comments about BRICS now, all typical. But yeah,
just on the one point you just said, you just refreshed about Taiwan. Look at last week, the Taiwanese leader went to Beijing. I don't think that would have happened 2 months ago.
No.
I think she saw what we all saw. Huge U.S. resources diverted from the Asia-Pacific theater into the Persian Gulf region. Exhausted stockpiles of U.S. munitions. And an erratic U.S. leadership. And I think that you're going to see more countries do that because that the writing's on the wall.
Yeah.
The U.S. can't beat Iran militarily. It's not going to fight a war with China over Taiwan. That's probably their thinking.
I mean, the Chinese military is not hasn't been tested in theater since the 1960s. There was a massive ousting or purge of the most senior military leadership of the PLA back in January. China does have economic limitations, but to your point, I mean, the other issue is that the Taiwanese government have been unwilling to pass a bill that would heavily strengthen or expand or whatever, modernize Taiwan's military. And because of that, the Americans sent a delegation over back in early March to try to get this done. And therefore, people are wondering that if Trump wraps up with Iran now and Xi and he do meet in May, is Trump sort of going to be persuaded by Xi, look, what's happening with Taiwan is sort of the same as what's happening in other places that you've been irritated by. So actually, you shouldn't bother. Xi's going to try to play it to Trump's, ego and psyche. So yeah, I think that the Chinese element is overblown in regard to Iran, but equally the Taiwanese theater is in a state of flux. I mean, when Trump undertook Operation Absolute Resolve in January, we didn't pay much attention to the fact that the Chinese did a massive amount of military exercises all around Taiwan. I mean, it was in the news, it was pretty important, but everyone's attention was completely absorbed by Trump's absolute lunacy. So definitely, I think Trump is emboldening China, but I think the Chinese are trying to play him on that.
Yeah, I think they are. And I also think that, yes, they may have not fought a war, but this war is in their theater. It's in their backyard. Wars fought in
ways away
backyard. That country tends to have home field advantage. And a country like China, which has been spending billions on their infrastructure and war-making capacity. Taiwan is not, the distance between Taiwan and China is not the distance between Iran and the United States. It's right there for them. And the swarm and the massive, push that they can make. It's a very big challenge for the U.S. Navy.
It is. And I think that this whole element around the first island chain or the second island chain has been completely undermined because, again, of Trump. He's actually
well, exactly.
News.
That's why she went over there. That's why he's and I think in many ways the U.S. is in their defense doctrine. They don't say this. They've kind of given up on that. They're now in the outer islands because they know that the inner islands it's tough to do.
The Japanese are being ditched. They're being played around with tariffs and economics, and they suffer more than anybody. Trump's comments.
South Korea, they took the interceptors away.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, exactly. So no, it all interlinks, but not in a way that people think that China's doing all that. It's just Trump.
No, it's the U.S. doing it to itself.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, it's the U.S. And we're only a year into this. We have 3 more years left.
Yay! Well, plenty more conversations with you, Amir, but it's been an absolute pleasure as always. Thank you so much for being willing to jump on, everyone. Amir Handjani, a non-resident fellow at the Quincy Institute and an author on Foreign Policy magazine and generally all-round expert on so many different things. Always a pleasure. Everyone watching, thank you so much. Thanks for checking, and we'll speak soon. Everyone, speak soon. Take care. Tomorrow, subscribe, like, all that jazz.